The air in Dr. Thorne's office was stale, thick with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken anxieties. Daniel sat on the edge of a stiff leather chair, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white mountains in a landscape of pale skin. For 6 months this had been his world, a rotating cast of specialists, the hushed tones of waiting rooms, the sterile white of examination chambers. A world that revolved entirely around his wife, Isabella, and her mysterious, debilitating illness. He hadn't had a full night's sleep in months, the architecture of his own life crumbling under the weight of her suffering. Dr. Thorne, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, swiveled in his chair, away from the glowing computer screen. He wasn't looking at Daniel, but at the thick manila folder on his desk. Isabella's history, a document that felt heavier than a tombstone. The doctor's silence was a physical presence in the room, a pressure against Daniel's eardrums. "Mr. Allister," Dr. Thorne began, his voice a low rumble, devoid of the practiced sympathy Daniel had grown accustomed to. He finally lifted his gaze, and his eyes, sharp and clear as polished steel, pinned Daniel to his chair. "We've run every test, scans, blood work, neurological evaluations. We've consulted with immunologists, endocrinologists. There is nothing physically wrong with your wife." Daniel's heart sank. It was the verdict he'd been dreading, the one that left them adrift in a sea of uncertainty. "So it's psychological? All in her head?" The words tasted like ash. He'd defended her against that very suggestion from his own sister just weeks ago. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, his expression unreadable. He tapped a single, blunt finger on the cover of the folder. "I didn't say that. I said there is nothing physically wrong. What I am saying is that I took the liberty of requesting the records from her previous primary care physician. The records concerning her first husband, Marcus." A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced the fog of Daniel's exhaustion. Marcus, the late husband, the tragic figure from Isabella's past, dead from a sudden, aggressive cancer before he was 30. A story she told with such heartbreaking, fragile beauty. The doctor's eyes held his. There was no pity in them, only a grave, clinical certainty. He saw the chart, the patterns, the history laid bare in black and white. "She's done this before, Mr. Allister," Dr. Thorne stated, the words landing like stones in the silent room. "The symptoms are identical. The timeline, the way it escalated. She's done this before, to her last husband." The world tilted. The sterile office, the leather chair, the granite-faced doctor, it all receded, becoming a distant, muffled tableau. Done this before. The phrase echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of Daniel's mind. It wasn't an accusation of murder, not in the legal sense. It was something more insidious, more terrifying. It was an accusation of a phantom illness, a performance of suffering so perfect, so all-consuming, that it had shadowed one man to his grave and was now consuming Daniel's life, piece by painstaking piece. He thought of Isabella in the waiting room, her beautiful face pale and drawn, a portrait of tragic fragility. He thought of his life, mortgaged to her care, his career on hold, his friendships withered. He thought he was a devoted husband. He didn't know he was the star of a revival, playing a role that had already been written. Within moments, his love would curdle into suspicion, and his life would pivot towards a truth more devastating than any diagnosis. "I know what you must be thinking. Run. Get out of there." But it's never that simple, is it? When you've built your life around someone, tearing it down feels like tearing down yourself. If you've ever felt trapped by a love that started to feel like a cage, I want you to hit that like button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story, this nightmare, it could happen anywhere, and you need to see how it ends. Daniel walked out of the office in a daze. The fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed unnaturally bright, buzzing with a hostile energy. Each step was a conscious effort, his legs feeling disconnected from his body. Dr. Thorne's words were a brand on his brain. She's done this before. He saw Isabella rise from her chair as he approached, a delicate, hopeful question in her wide blue eyes. She was a masterwork of art, her cashmere wrap draped just so over her thin shoulders, her dark hair falling in a soft wave across her pale cheek. "Well?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "What did he say? Is it another specialist? Did they find something on the scans this time?" Daniel looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in a long time, not as his sick wife, but as a stranger. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she reached for him, a tremor he had always attributed to weakness. Now he wondered if it was a tic, a piece of performance. He saw the subtle sheen of moisture in her eyes, making them luminous, and wondered if it was a symptom of pain or a trick of the light she had mastered. He said, "They're still looking," Daniel lied. The lie came easily, a product of long practice in shielding her from bad news, from stress, from anything that might trigger a spell. But this lie was different. It was not a shield for her, it was a shield for him. A barrier he was erecting, brick by invisible brick, while he tried to process the cataclysm that had just occurred. Still looking? Her face fell, the hope draining away to be replaced by a familiar, theatrical despair. "Oh, Daniel, I just don't know how much more of this I can take. I feel so untethered, like my body isn't my own." She leaned against him, her weight slight but demanding. He automatically put his arm around her, the gesture as ingrained as breathing. But today, her touch felt alien. The warmth of her skin felt like a fever. He drove them home in silence, his mind a maelstrom. Isabella rested her head against the passenger window, her eyes closed, a portrait of exhaustion he had once found heartbreaking. Now he studied her reflection in the glass. The smooth brow, the gentle curve of her lips. Was it a mask? Was the woman he loved a fiction, a character she inhabited for an audience of one? He remembered the beginning, not the beginning of their love, which had been a whirlwind of gallery openings, late-night talks, and the intoxicating belief that he had found a kindred spirit. No, he remembered the beginning of the illness. It had started subtly, a ghost in their happy home, a complaint of fatigue that lingered too long after a common cold, headaches that bloomed without warning, a sudden dizziness that caused her to grip the kitchen counter, her knuckles white, her face ashen. At first, he was the perfect, doting husband. He made her tea. He drew her baths. He canceled their plans, assuring her that all that mattered was her rest. "You just push yourself too hard, my love," he'd said, stroking her hair. Her family had descended with worried, fluttering concern. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman who wore her wealth like armor, would sweep into their home, her presence filling every room. She would appraise Daniel's efforts with a critical eye. "Are you sure she's getting enough vitamin D, Daniel? I've read a study. You should be opening the curtains more. The light in this house is so dreary." Her brother Julian, a man who had inherited his father's fortune, but not his charm, would stand with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Look, Daniel, we appreciate you trying, but maybe it's time to get a professional in here. A full-time nurse, someone who knows what they're doing." The implication was always clear. He was not enough. He was failing her. The sicker Isabella became, the more diminished he was in their eyes, shrinking from partner to caregiver, from caregiver to servant. They would sit in the living room with Isabella, propped up on a mountain of soap pillows, speaking in low, conspiratorial tones while he was in the kitchen, preparing a special broth she was suddenly able to tolerate. He would hear snippets of their conversation, words that stung like paper cuts. He looked so tired. Well, it's a lot to handle for someone like him. Isabella is used to a certain level of care. He had accepted their condescension as a byproduct of their love for her. He had absorbed their criticism, believing it stemmed from a genuine place of worry. Now, Dr. Thorne's words recontextualized every memory. He saw it not as love, but as something else, a conspiracy of enablers. They weren't just supporting Isabella, they were co-authors of her narrative, reinforcing the very walls of the prison she was building around them both. He remembered one afternoon a month ago. He had come home early from a meeting he'd taken from his home office. His career as a successful architect now reduced to a few remote projects he could squeeze in between appointments. He had heard laughter from the living room, not Isabella's weak, breathy chuckle, but a full, throaty laugh, rich and alive. He had frozen in the hallway, his heart leaping with hope. Was she better? Had there been a breakthrough? He peered around the corner. Isabella was on the phone, her back to him. She was animated, gesturing with one hand as she talked, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "Oh, you wouldn't believe it," she was saying, her voice vibrant. "He fell for it completely, bought the most expensive organic ginger root you've ever seen. Honestly, Julian, he's like a little puppy." Then she must have sensed him. Her body went rigid. The laughter died in her throat. She turned slowly, the phone still pressed to her ear. When she saw him, a transformation occurred. It was instantaneous, terrifying in its perfection. The color drained from her face. Her shoulders slumped. Her hand flew to her forehead as if struck by a sudden migraine. I have to go," she whispered into the phone. "I'm not feeling well." She had looked at him, her eyes wide with pain. "Daniel, thank God you're home. I was just trying to feel normal for a moment. I pushed myself too hard. The room is spinning." He had rushed to her side, catching her as she swayed. He had held her, cursed himself for not being there sooner, and believed every word. He had believed the performance. Now the memory played back in his mind, but with a new soundtrack, the doctor's grim pronouncement. The laughter he had heard was not a sign of recovery. It was a glimpse behind the curtain. And he, the devoted husband, was the punchline to the joke. The garage door rumbled shut, encasing them in the cool darkness of their own home. He helped her out of the car, her arm draped heavily over his shoulder. "I'll get you to bed, my love," he said, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil within. But as he led her inside, into the beautiful, oppressive house that had become her stage, he knew he wasn't just leading his wife to her room. He was escorting an actress off stage after a long and convincing show, and he was finally, terrifyingly, awake in the audience. The house felt different that evening. The familiar objects, the plush sofa where Isabella spent most of her days, the neatly organized pill caddy on the kitchen counter, the stack of medical journals on the coffee table, now seemed like props on a meticulously designed set. Daniel moved through the rooms with a newfound, chilling clarity. Every surface held a memory, and every memory was now suspect. He helped Isabella change into her silk pajamas, the fabric cool and slippery beneath his fingers. Her sighs of pain as she moved, the wince as she lay back against the pillows. Were they real? Or were they practiced gestures, honed over years of performance, first for Marcus, now for him? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in his gut. "Could you bring me some warm water with lemon, darling?" she asked, her voice faint. "My throat feels so scratchy." "Of course," he said. His own voice was a marvel to him, a steady, calm thing that bore no resemblance to the screaming chaos in his head. In the kitchen, he leaned against the cold granite countertop, the same one she'd clung to months ago while feigning dizziness. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the pieces of his life back into an order that made sense. Love, trust, partnership. These were the foundations upon which he had built his marriage. Now he felt the sickening lurch of the ground giving way beneath him. Dr. Thorne's words had planted a seed of doubt, and the memory of Isabella's phone call had watered it. It was growing, its roots cracking the very bedrock of his reality. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. He had no proof, only a doctor's suspicion and a half-heard conversation. She would deny it, of course. She would weep. She would accuse him of cruelty, of abandoning her in her time of need. Her family would rally to her side, painting him as a monster. He would be the villain in her tragic story. No, a direct confrontation was a fool's errand. He was an architect. He understood the importance of a solid foundation, of gathering materials, of drawing up a precise blueprint before beginning construction. He would not demolish his life with a sledgehammer. He would dismantle it, piece by piece, with surgical precision. He opened his laptop, the screen's glow casting a stark light on his face. He created a new, password-protected file, naming it something innocuous, Project Nightingale. Inside, he created a simple spreadsheet, columns for date, time, food and drink consumed, medication taken, reported symptoms, and a final column for his own observations. This digital ledger would be his first tool, his secret journal. He started with today. He logged the time they left the doctor's office, the lie he told her, the way she leaned on him, the request for lemon water. In the observations column, he wrote, "Appeared disappointed when I said the doctor had no news. Performance of despair seemed immediate and slightly overwrought. No visible signs of a scratchy throat. It felt clinical. It felt cold. It felt like a betrayal of the man he thought he was, the loving husband. But it also felt necessary, a small act of self-preservation in a world that had suddenly become hostile territory. He was no longer just a caregiver, he was a surveyor, mapping the terrain of a colossal deceit." The next day, the performance continued as scheduled. Isabella's mother, Eleanor, arrived mid-morning, not with a knock, but with her own key, a privilege she exercised often. She breezed in, carrying a ridiculously expensive bouquet of lilies, whose scent immediately filled the house with a funereal sweetness. "Daniel," she said, her tone brisk as she handed him the vase, "find somewhere for these, and the water is probably filthy. Be a dear and change it." It wasn't a request. He took the flowers, his jaw tight. He went to the kitchen, the stems cold and wet in his hand. He could hear their voices from the living room. "He seems so frayed," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "He's trying his best, Mother," Isabella replied, her voice weak but with an undercurrent of martyrdom. "It's just a lot for him to manage. He's not used to this kind of pressure." Daniel stood at the sink, the water running over his hands. Frayed, not used to pressure. They spoke of him as if he were a delicate instrument, unsuited for the task, when it was he who was holding their fragile world together. It was a classic humiliation, a subtle but effective way to reinforce his role as the hired help. He meticulously trimmed the stems of the lilies, the snip of the shears a small, satisfying sound. He arranged them in the vase, his architect's eye for form and balance taking over. Then he took out his phone, opened a secure notes app, a backup for Project Nightingale, and typed, "Eleanor arrived 10:15 a.m., immediately infantilized me. Discussion with I framed me as incompetent. I's voice was weak, but she did not defend me. She reinforced the narrative." He carried the vase back into the living room and placed it on a side table. "There you are," he said, his voice pleasant. Eleanor gave the arrangement a cursory glance. A little asymmetrical, but it will do." She turned her attention back to Isabella, who was nestled among her pillows. "Now, darling, Julian and I were thinking, this house is so large, and Daniel has his work, what little he can manage from home. We think it's time we hired a proper live-in nurse, someone to be here 24/7. Isabella looked at Daniel, her blue eyes wide and pleading. It was a look that said, "Don't make me choose. Don't fight them on this. It's for the best." In the past, he would have argued. He would have insisted that he could care for her, that his place was by her side. But today was different. He saw the strategy. A live-in nurse wouldn't just be a helper. She would be a wall between him and Isabella, a professional witness who could be more easily manipulated, her observations more easily dismissed or guided. She would further isolate him. He smiled, a calm, measured smile that seemed to surprise them both. "You know, Eleanor," he said, his tone thoughtful, "that's an excellent idea. I've been worried about leaving her alone even for a minute when I have to take a call. It would be a great relief." Eleanor looked momentarily thrown, her prepared arguments suddenly useless. Isabella's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had expected a fight, a passionate declaration of his devotion that would ultimately prove futile, but would reassure her of his emotional investment. His easy acquiescence was a move she hadn't anticipated. "Well," Eleanor said, recovering, "good, I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. I'll have my assistant start looking for suitable candidates immediately. Only the best, of course." "Of course," Daniel echoed, his smile never wavering. He looked at Isabella. "Whatever you need, my love." He retreated to his office, the door clicking softly shut behind him. He sat at his desk, the blueprints for a new library he was designing spread out before him. Clean lines, honest materials, a structure whose purpose was clear and transparent. He longed for that kind of clarity in his own life. He knew he had just ceded a piece of territory in his own home, but it was a strategic retreat. Let them bring in a nurse. Let them build their fortress. He was no longer fighting them on their terms. He was documenting. He was observing. He was an architect drawing a blueprint of a ruin. And soon, he would understand its structure well enough to bring the whole rotten thing down. The days that followed settled into a new, stranger rhythm. Daniel played his part with unnerving perfection. He was the concerned husband, the grateful son-in-law, the man relieved to have help. He deferred to Eleanor's judgment, agreed with Julian's pronouncements, and catered to Isabella's every whim with a serene smile. His compliance was a form of camouflage, allowing him to observe without being observed. His secret spreadsheet grew, a silent testament to the drama unfolding in the house. Tuesday, 7:15 p.m. I complained of sharp stomach pains after eating the risotto I made, pushed the plate away after 2 bites. Observation. An hour later, I saw her in the kitchen finishing the leftovers, standing in the pantry's shadow, eating quickly from the container. Thursday, 2:30 p.m. Severe headache, required all curtains be drawn, complained of light sensitivity. Observation. Later found her on her tablet in the darkened room, screen brightness at maximum, scrolling through a luxury shopping website. Each entry was a small, cold stone laid on the scales of justice. The weight of his love and devotion on one side, the mounting evidence of her deceit on the other. The balance was beginning to tip. His nights were spent not in restless sleep, but in quiet, methodical research. While the house was silent, while Isabella slept the supposedly fitful sleep of the chronically ill, Daniel sat bathed in the glow of his laptop. He typed Marcus Thorne into the search bar. The results were sparse, just as he'd found before. A digital ghost. There was a brief obituary from a local paper in a town 300 miles away, mentioning a brave battle with a sudden illness. He was survived by his loving wife Isabella and his sister, Clara Thorne. Clara Thorne. The name stuck with him. He searched for her on social media. It was a long shot, a desperate stab in the digital dark. He found a few possibilities, but one profile stood out. A woman in her late 30s, with kind, intelligent eyes, and a picture of her standing beside a smiling young man who was unmistakably Marcus, the man from the single photo Isabella kept on her nightstand. Daniel's finger hovered over the message button. What could he possibly say? "Hello, I think my wife may have psychologically tortured your brother to death, and now she's doing it to me?" It was insane. It was accusatory. It was the kind of message a person immediately deletes and blocks. He spent an hour crafting the message, writing and deleting, his architect's precision warring with the raw, chaotic emotion of his situation. He needed to be careful, respectful, and just desperate enough to be believed. Finally, he typed, "Dear Ms. Thorne, please forgive this intrusion. My name is Daniel Allister. I am Isabella's husband. I am writing to you for a reason I find difficult to explain, and I am doing so in complete confidence. I am trying to understand something about my wife's health, and I came across your brother's name. I know his passing was a great tragedy, and I hesitate to cause you any pain, but I feel I have nowhere else to turn. If you would be willing to speak with me for just a few minutes, I would be eternally grateful. I believe our situations may have something in common." He read it over a dozen times. It was vague, but pointed. It hinted at a shared experience without making a wild accusation. He pressed send, his heart hammering against his ribs. The message sat there, a single blue checkmark beside it. Sent. Not delivered, not read. For 2 days he heard nothing. The silence from Clara Thorne was a quiet torment. He found himself checking his phone constantly, a new anxiety layered on top of the old. During those 2 days, the new nurse arrived. Her name was Agnes, a stout, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with a practiced, professional air. Eleanor had hired her, and Agnes reported directly to Eleanor, sending her daily updates. Daniel watched the dynamic between Agnes and Isabella with keen interest. Isabella laid on the performance thick, her moans of pain more frequent, her requests more demanding. Agnes was impassive. She fluffed pillows, administered medications, mostly vitamins and supplements Daniel knew were placebos, and recorded everything in a small, leather-bound notebook. She was a professional observer, just like him, but her observations were being filtered through the lens Eleanor had provided, that of a tragic, suffering woman. On the third night, as Daniel was updating his own log, a notification popped up on his screen. A new message. From Clara Thorne. His breath caught. He clicked it open. The message was short, cautious. "Mr. Allister, I received your message. I don't know what you mean, but my brother's memory is all I have. I live an hour north of the city. There's a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind in my town. I can be there tomorrow at 1 p.m. Come alone." Relief washed over him, so potent it left him lightheaded. It was a chance, a fragile, tentative chance to find an ally, to find someone else who might have seen behind the curtain. The next day, he told Isabella he had a critical, in-person site meeting for his library project, one he couldn't possibly miss. It was the first time in months he had prioritized his work. Isabella's reaction was telling. She didn't protest. She didn't plead with him to stay. Instead, a flicker of something, annoyance, resentment, crossed her face before being replaced by weary resignation. "Of course, Daniel," she said, turning her face away from him. "Your work is important. Agnes will be here with me." It was a dismissal. He was no longer required. He had been replaced. In the past, this would have wounded him. Today, it was the perfect cover. The drive north was a journey out of the fog. The further he got from the city, from his oppressive, beautiful house, the clearer his head became. The world outside was crisp and autumnal, the trees blazing with color. It was a world that operated on honest principles of seasons and cycles, a world away from the artificial climate of his marriage. The Daily Grind was a small, unassuming place, filled with the rich aroma of coffee and the low hum of conversation. He saw her immediately, sitting in a booth by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked just like her picture, but older, her kind eyes etched with a sadness that seemed permanent. He approached the table. "Clara?" She looked up, her expression wary. "Mr. Allister, thank you for coming. Please call me Daniel." He slid into the booth opposite her. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. He didn't know where to begin. She saved him the trouble. She looked at him, her gaze direct and searching, and said the words that broke the dam. "You have the same look in your eyes that my brother had," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The last year of his life, a kind of haunted confusion, like he was the only sane person in a world that had gone mad. "So tell me, Daniel, what is she doing to you?" The question was so direct, so validating, that Daniel felt a profound sense of release. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a monster for suspecting his own wife. He was seeing a pattern that someone else had seen before. The quiet before the storm had passed. Now the rain was beginning to fall. He started to talk. He told her everything. The mysterious symptoms, the condescending family, the doctor's warning, the spreadsheet on his laptop. He spoke for nearly an hour, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of frustration and fear. Clara listened without interruption, her expression shifting from cautious sympathy to a grim, heartbreaking recognition. It was as if he were reading from a script she already knew by heart. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and exposed, she nodded slowly. "The fatigue," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The sudden food allergies, the headaches that would leave him bedridden for days, but only when they had plans to see friends. Marcus became a ghost in his own life. And she was the perfect grieving angel, caring for him, isolating him from anyone who might question it." Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself. Marcus knew. Towards the end, he knew something was deeply wrong. He was a scientist, a chemist. He was methodical, like you. He started keeping a journal, not just of his symptoms, but of hers. Her moods, her spending, her conversations. He started to suspect she was inducing the symptoms. Not all of them, maybe, but some. Enough to keep the narrative going. Daniel stared at her, his blood running cold. Inducing them? It was a thought so dark he hadn't allowed himself to fully form it. "He told me about it a week before he died," Clara continued, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "He called me, frantic. He said he had proof. He said Isabella was a black hole," his words. "She fed on sympathy. It was her drug. He was going to leave her. He was getting out." "What happened?" Daniel breathed. "He had a heart attack," Clara said, the words flat and brutal. "A massive coronary, the official cause of death. The doctors said his body was just depleted, worn out from his long illness. But I always wondered, the stress she put him under, for years, it was a weapon, a slow, patient weapon." She reached into the large tote bag at her feet and pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal. Its pages were worn, the corners soft. "This was his," she said, pushing it across the table. "And these," she laid a folder next to it. "Copies of his medical notes, bank statements showing her spending habits during his sickest periods. He gave them to me for safekeeping that day he called. He told me, 'If anything happens to me, Clara, don't let her get away with it.' But she was the grieving widow. Who would have believed me?" Daniel opened the journal. The handwriting was precise, scientific. The entries were chillingly familiar. May 10th. Sudden onset of vertigo after breakfast. I insisted I stay in bed. Canceled my trip to the lab. Later, found the salt shaker in the pantry nearly empty. My blood pressure has been inexplicably high. June 3rd. Severe joint pain. I gave me a new herbal supplement a friend recommended. Pain worsened. Looked up the herb online. In high doses, it's known to cause inflammatory responses. It was a mirror image of his own spreadsheet, but a decade older. The same plays, the same script, the same devastating outcome. He saw a list of grievances compiled by a ghost, a voice from the grave validating every single one of his own suspicions. The symbolic object wasn't just a journal, it was a testament, it was proof. "She told me he died of cancer," Daniel said, his voice numb. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "Of course she did. It's more tragic that way, more poetic. A heart attack is messy, complicated. Cancer is a noble battle. Isabella is all about the narrative." Daniel closed the journal, his hands trembling. The weight of it in his lap was immense. It was the foundation he needed. It was the blueprint for the deconstruction to come. He looked at Clara, at this unexpected ally, who had just handed him the keys to his own liberation. "Thank you, he said, the words inadequate but filled with a profound, desperate gratitude. "I won't let his story be forgotten. I won't let her get away with it this time." Clara's expression was hard, determined. "She's not just a narcissist, Daniel. She's a predator. She finds good, caring men and she hollows them out. My brother was brilliant and full of life. Look what she turned him into. Don't let her do it to you." He drove home with Marcus Thorne's journal on the passenger seat beside him. It felt like a passenger, a silent witness to the crime that was his marriage. The autumnal beauty of the countryside was lost on him now. All he saw was the road ahead, a path leading to a confrontation he now knew was inevitable. He was no longer just an observer. He was an avenger. He held the truth in his hands, and it was heavier and sharper than any stone. He would not throw it. He would place it, carefully and deliberately, at the center of the life they had built, and he would watch the entire fraudulent structure collapse around it. The plan formed in his mind with the cool, calculated clarity of an architectural design. It would not be an emotional explosion. It would be a controlled demolition. The stage had to be perfect, the audience assembled, the script meticulously prepared. He needed her enablers present. He needed Eleanor and Julian to be there, not just as spectators but as players in the final act, forced to confront the roles they had so eagerly played. The opportunity presented itself a week later. Eleanor called, her voice brimming with manufactured excitement. "Daniel, wonderful news! Agnes says Isabella had a good day. She ate a full meal and even sat in the garden for 20 minutes. We must celebrate this milestone. Julian and I will be over for dinner on Saturday. A small, quiet celebration. Don't you think that's a marvelous idea?" "It's a marvelous idea, Eleanor," Daniel said, his voice smooth as silk. A celebration. The irony was exquisite. It was the perfect stage. On Saturday, Daniel spent the day preparing. He cooked Isabella's favorite meal, a complex seafood paella that required hours of attention. The familiar process of chopping and sautéing, once an act of love, was now a methodical preparation for war. He moved through the kitchen with a calm, focused energy. He was not the frayed, exhausted caregiver anymore. He was a man with a purpose. He set the dining table with their best china and silver. He lit candles. He created an atmosphere of intimate celebration, a perfect picture of domestic bliss. Tucked away on the sideboard, beneath a linen napkin, were two items: his own sleek black moleskin notebook, where he'd printed his Project Nightingale spreadsheet, and Marcus Thorne's thick, worn leather journal, the symbolic objects, the evidence. Isabella was radiant, propped up by her mother, wearing a flowing silk caftan that made her look ethereal. She played the part of the courageous invalid, making a valiant recovery. She accepted their praise with a weak but beatific smile. "Oh, it's nothing," she demurred when Julian toasted to her strength. "I couldn't do it without my family. And Daniel, of course, he's been such a rock." She glanced at him, a brief, dismissive acknowledgement. They ate, the conversation flowing around the familiar topics: Isabella's health, the incompetence of doctors, the brilliance of the new nurse, Agnes. Daniel remained largely silent, observing, letting them build the scene, letting them reinforce their collective fiction. He watched Eleanor place a hand on Isabella's forehead, declaring her to be a little warm. He watched Julian lecture him on the proper temperature for the house. They were so comfortable in their roles, so secure in their narrative. Finally, when the plates were cleared and dessert was served, a lemon tart he had made from scratch, Daniel placed his hands on the table. "I'm so glad you're all here," he began, his voice quiet but carrying a new authority that made them all pause. "It's true, it's a night for celebration, but not just for Isabella's good day. It's a celebration of clarity." Eleanor frowned. "Clarity? Daniel, what are you talking about?" Daniel met her gaze. I'm talking about finally understanding the nature of Isabella's illness. He let the statement hang in the air. Isabella's smile tightened. Daniel, please, don't be dramatic. It's been a nice evening. I'm not being dramatic, my love. I'm being precise. He reached over to the sideboard and picked up his black notebook. He placed it on the table. I've been keeping a log. As an architect, I appreciate patterns, structures, and I found the most remarkable structure in our lives. He opened the notebook. Let's take, for example, Tuesday, October 12th. Isabella, you reported severe dizziness and fatigue at 10 a.m., forcing you to cancel your physical therapy appointment. He looked at her. Do you remember that? Vaguely, she said, her voice strained. My days, they blur together. I'm sure they do, Daniel said, his tone still gentle. But I remember, because at 10:15 a.m., you received a shipping notification for a pair of $5,000 shoes you had ordered. The appointment you canceled was with a therapist Julian had called aggressively optimistic. You didn't want to go. Julian scoffed. What are you implying? That she faked being dizzy to get out of an appointment? I'm not implying anything, Daniel said calmly. I'm presenting data. He turned a page. Or how about the sudden onset of your gluten intolerance 3 months ago? It began the day after my sister suggested we go on a trip to Italy, a trip I know you didn't want to take. The intolerance vanished last week. On the same day you finished the last bite of a cake Eleanor brought over from your favorite bakery. He was using the questions that carry implicit accusations technique, laying out facts that led to an unavoidable conclusion. Each statement was a verbal chess move, boxing them in. This is absurd, Eleanor snapped, her face flushing with anger. Daniel, you are exhausted and you're lashing out. You should be ashamed, upsetting Isabella like this. She turned to her daughter, who was beginning to look genuinely pale. Don't listen to him, darling. But Daniel didn't look at Eleanor. He kept his eyes on Isabella. Am I upsetting you, Isabella? Or am I just turning on the lights? He had built the foundation. Now it was time for the quiet bomb. He reached for the second book, the old leather journal. He placed it on the table next to his own. The two books, one new and one old, sat side by side, a parallel structure of deceit. What is that? Isabella asked, her voice a thin thread. She recognized it. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. The mask was beginning to crack. I was curious about your first husband, Marcus, Daniel said softly. You told me he died of a rare, aggressive cancer, a tragedy. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But that's not true, is it? He died of a heart attack, a massive coronary, according to the death certificate. The room went completely still. The only sound was the faint flicker of the candles. Eleanor and Julian stared at him, stunned into silence. How dare you, Eleanor finally sputtered, to bring up that tragedy? It was a tragedy, Daniel agreed, his voice hardening for the first time. But perhaps not in the way you think. He opened Marcus's journal. This was his. He was a scientist, very methodical. He kept a log, too, just like mine. He began to read. His voice was steady, dispassionate, the voice of a man reading a technical manual. May 10th. Sudden onset of vertigo after breakfast. I insisted I stay in bed. Canceled my trip to the lab. He paused and looked up. Sound familiar? He also noted that he later found the salt shaker, which had been full, was nearly empty. He suspected she was poisoning his food to elevate his blood pressure. Isabella made a small, choking sound. Daniel continued, his voice relentless. June 3rd, severe joint pain. I gave me a new herbal supplement. Pain worsened. He went on to identify the herb. In high doses, it's a known inflammatory agent. He looked directly at Isabella, his gaze unwavering. He has an entry in here from the week before he died. He wrote that he had discovered you were faking your fainting spells. He'd replaced the smelling salts you kept by the bed with plain water. He watched you pretend to be revived by them. The statement landed. Simple. devastating, final. He called you a black hole, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He said you fed on sympathy. He was going to leave you, and then his heart gave out. The stress, the constant manipulation, the fear, it finally killed him. He closed the journal. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Isabella stared at the book, her face a mask of horror. Not of remorse, Daniel realized, but of exposure. The beautiful, fragile patient had vanished. In her place sat a cornered animal. Julian was the first to break, his arrogance crumbling into blustering denial. This is insane. You're getting this from some old book? You're believing the ramblings of a dead man over your own wife? It's not just the book, Julian, Daniel said, his voice calm again. He was using the moral mirror now, reflecting their own behavior back at them. It's the patterns, it's the lies, it's the way you all participated. You, Julian, who constantly undermined me and suggested I wasn't competent to care for her, making her more dependent on your validation. And you, Eleanor, he turned to his mother-in-law. Her face was ashen. You have been the chief enabler, he said, his words precise and cutting. You didn't just support her, you directed the play. You enjoyed the drama. You enjoyed having your daughter need you again. You enjoyed the power it gave you over her, and over me. You both fed her illness because it fed your own egos. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had stripped them of their self-righteousness, forcing them to see their own complicity. Finally, all eyes turned to Isabella. She sat bolt upright, her fragility gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. The performance was over. So you found his pathetic little book, she hissed, her voice unrecognizable, hard and sharp as broken glass. And you talked to her, didn't you? That sanctimonious sister of his, Clara. It was a confession, a full and complete admission, not in what she said, but in what she didn't deny. Yes, Daniel said, I talked to Clara, the woman whose brother you destroyed. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted. He, the quiet, accommodating husband, now held all the cards. And they, the arrogant, dismissive family, had nothing. The beautiful house, once their stage, had become their courtroom. The candles on the table no longer felt celebratory. They felt like the lights of an interrogation room. The reversal of fortune was complete. Those who had humiliated him now sat in stunned silence, their own reflections staring back at them, ugly and exposed. The immediate aftermath was not the explosion of rage Daniel had anticipated. It was something far more pathetic. Julian, his face pale and slack, simply stared at his sister as if seeing her for the first time. Eleanor, the matriarch, the woman of iron will, seemed to shrink in her chair. All the air had gone out of her. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. Isabella, however, was a different story. The mask of the invalid had been torn away, and what lay beneath was not a frightened woman, but a furious one. Her tantrum, when it came, was not one of remorse, but of pure, narcissistic injury. You did this to ruin me, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Daniel. Her voice, so recently a fragile whisper, was now raw and powerful. You were always jealous, jealous of my family, jealous of the attention I received. You couldn't stand that the world didn't revolve around you for 5 minutes. Daniel didn't respond. He simply watched her, his expression one of calm, sorrowful finality. Her accusations were so far from the truth they were meaningless, the desperate flailings of a drowning person trying to pull their rescuer under with them. And you too, she spun on her mother and brother. You just sit there? He's slandering me. He's calling me a monster. Are you going to let him? Julian finally found his voice, but it was weak, uncertain. Isabella, is it true? What he read from the journal? About the salt? The supplements? "Of course it's not true," she screamed. "It's a book of lies written by a weak, pathetic man who couldn't handle a strong woman." But the denial was hollow. They had all seen her reaction when Daniel first produced the journal. They had seen the terror in her eyes. They knew. In that moment, her spell over them was broken. They were no longer seeing their beloved, fragile Bella. They were seeing a stranger, a venomous, hateful creature they had nurtured and enabled. Daniel stood up. "I'm not here to argue," he said, his voice cutting through her tirade. "I'm here to state facts. The performance is over, Isabella." He looked at the three of them, a family unit fractured by the truth. "Here is what is going to happen. Isabella, you are going to get real, professional psychiatric help. Not a sympathetic doctor who will enable you, but a proper therapist at a long-term treatment facility. You are deeply unwell, and you are a danger to yourself and to anyone who tries to love you." He then turned to Eleanor and Julian. "And you two are going to support that. You are going to stop feeding this sickness. You will attend family therapy. You will learn what you have done. Or," he let the word hang in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. He tapped the two journals on the table. "Or this all becomes public. Marcus's story deserves to be heard, and I have made digital copies of everything. I will not have another person's life destroyed by this addiction to suffering." It was a checkmate. He had them trapped between the ruin of their family's reputation and the difficult, painful path of genuine change. "You can't do this," Isabella whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a chilling, reptilian coldness. "I'll tell everyone you abused me, that you're the monster." "Go ahead," Daniel said, his voice devoid of fear. "Who will they believe? The man with two meticulously kept journals, a doctor's testimony, and the sister of your dead husband on his side? Or the woman who has been caught in a decade-long lie that has already cost one man his life?" She had nothing. He had taken away her stage, her audience, and her script. She was an actress with no lines, and she simply crumpled. She buried her face in her hands, and her body was racked with sobs. But Daniel knew, with a terrible certainty, that she was not weeping for Marcus, or for the love she had destroyed. She was weeping for herself, for the loss of her power. He walked out of the room, leaving them to the wreckage. He went to the guest room, locked the door, and packed a small bag. The house that he had once loved, the home he had built with his wife, felt like a tomb. He could hear their voices from the dining room, no longer arguing, but low, broken murmurs, the sound of a world ending. He left a note on the hall table with the name and number of a renowned psychiatric facility that specialized in personality disorders. Beside it, he left his wedding ring and his key to the house. As he walked out the front door into the cool night air, he didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He felt a profound, aching emptiness. The vindication he had sought was a hollow victory. He had won the war, but the cost had been everything. He had exposed the truth, but the truth was a hideous thing. He had freed himself from the prison of Isabella's illness, but he was now adrift, his past a ruin, and his future an unnerving, empty space. He had done the right thing. He had honored Marcus's memory. But as he drove away from the house, leaving the lights and the drama behind, he felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The months that followed were a study in reconstruction. Daniel moved into a minimalist apartment in a part of the city he had always loved, a place with clean lines and large windows that flooded the rooms with honest, unfiltered light. He had designed the space in his mind 100 times during the darkest days of his marriage, a sanctuary of simplicity and truth. Now, living in it felt like breathing for the first time in years. He threw himself into his work. The library project, which had languished for so long, became his focus. He found solace in the logic of architecture, in the way honest materials and sound design could create something beautiful and enduring, a structure that didn't lie. His partners, who had watched his decline with worried patience, welcomed him back without question, their silent support a balm on his wounded spirit. There was no contact from Isabella or her family for the first 2 months, just a stark, formal letter from their lawyer confirming the initiation of divorce proceedings, which Daniel's own lawyer handled with quiet efficiency. The silence was a gift. It allowed him the space to heal, to untangle the complex knot of love, pity, and deception that had defined his life for so long. He often thought of Marcus. He would sometimes take out the worn leather journal, not to relive the horror, but to honor the man who had tried to fight back. Daniel felt a strange kinship with the ghost in those pages, a shared understanding that transcended time. He had not just saved himself, he had, in a small way, given Marcus the justice he never received in life. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The return address was from the small town he had driven to on that fateful autumn day. It was from Clara Thorne. He opened it, his hand steady. "Dear Daniel," it began, "I heard through a mutual acquaintance that you and Isabella have separated. I don't know the details, and I don't need to. But I wanted to write to you and say thank you. For years, I have carried the weight of my brother's story alone. I felt like I was the only one who knew the truth, and it was a terrible, isolating burden. You didn't just listen to me, you believed me. You gave my brother's voice a chance to be heard again. Whatever you did what Marcus was trying to do for himself. You got out. You chose life. Thank you for your courage. I hope you find peace." Daniel folded the letter, a lump forming in his throat. It was the absolution he didn't know he needed. He had not been an avenger, not really. He had been a survivor, and in surviving, he had validated another's struggle. A few weeks later, he received an unexpected call. It was from Julian. His voice was different, stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by a hesitant, humbled tone. "Daniel," he said, I know you have no reason to talk to me, but I felt I had to call to apologize." Daniel was silent, waiting. "You were right," Julian continued, the words sounding difficult for him. "About everything. We were blind. We saw what we wanted to see. My mother and we're in therapy now, with Isabella's doctors. It's hard, unspeakably hard, to look at what we did, what we allowed to happen." He told Daniel that Isabella was in a residential treatment facility. She was fighting the therapy, resisting at every turn, but she was there. The threat of public exposure had been the only thing that could force their hand, but now that they were in it, Julian was starting to see the depth of the family's dysfunction. "The doctor said we were part of the system," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "That she couldn't have done it without us, without our applause. God, Daniel, I am so sorry for what we put you through, for what we helped her do to you, and to him, to Marcus." It was not a plea for forgiveness, but a confession. It was the first sign that genuine change, however painful, might be possible. "Thank you for the call, Julian," Daniel said, his voice even. "I wish you all the best in your recovery. All of you." He hung up, feeling a sense of closure. He felt no anger towards Julian, only a distant pity. They were all victims of Isabella's illness, including her family, who were now just beginning their own long journey out of the darkness she had created. That evening, Daniel sat by his large window, looking out at the city lights. The world was vast and full of possibilities. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that some people live in structures of their own making, built on foundations of lies, and that to love them is to become a prisoner within those walls. He had learned that true strength isn't about enduring the unendurable. It's about having the courage to see the truth, to speak the truth, and to tear down the rotten structure, no matter the cost, so you can build again. His life was his own now. The design was clean, the future unwritten. He picked up a pencil and a fresh sheet of paper, the tools of his trade, the instruments of creation. And he began to sketch. Not a library, not a house for a client. He began to sketch a life, his life, built with honest materials, on a foundation of hard-won truth. The past was a ruin, but from those ruins he would build something strong, something beautiful, something real. The story of what happened with Isabella is a difficult one, but it's a necessary one. It teaches us that the most dangerous prisons are not the ones with bars, but the ones we build in our minds and in our relationships, decorated with love and obligation. It teaches us that true worth isn't about the appearance of strength or fragility, but about the quiet, unshakable integrity that lives within. We all deserve to live in the truth. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own peace? To tear something down in order to rebuild? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories give strength to others. And if you found value in this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of truth, justice, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.